Marcus Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Elite Gentlemen's Club, swirling his aged whiskey as he looked down at the glittering city of New York. At 45, he had everything money could buy. A tech empire worth billions, multiple mansions across the globe, and a reputation for being impossibly hard to impress. Getting bored of the usual entertainment, Sterling, Richard Montgomery, another regular at the club, approached him with a smirk. The older man was known for his outrageous bets and questionable morals. Marcus turned, his expensive suit catching the warm lighting of the club. When you have everything, Montgomery, very little remains entertaining. A small group of their fellow billionaires gathered around them, sensing the beginning of something interesting. These evening gatherings often led to high-stakes bets that would make ordinary people's heads spin. Then perhaps we can make things more interesting, Montgomery said, pulling out his checkbook. How about a bet that will challenge even the great Marcus Sterling? The room grew quiet. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued despite himself. What kind of bet are we talking about? Montgomery's smile grew wider. Marriage. A few chuckles echoed around the room. Everyone knew Marcus was proudly single, claiming marriage was for those who couldn't handle freedom. You want me to get married? That's your big challenge? Marcus scoffed. Not just married, Montgomery continued. Married to someone specific, someone who will test everything you claim to stand for. He pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a photo. Kenya Williams, former civil rights attorney, stage 4 breast cancer, and yes, she's black. The room fell silent. Everyone knew about Marcus's past comments about racial diversity in tech, comments that had cost him several PR nightmares. You want me to marry a dying woman? Marcus's voice was cold. For 6 months, Montgomery specified. If you make it through 6 months of marriage to her, I'll hand over my shares in the Singapore project. Worth about $2 billion, give or take. Marcus stared at the photo longer. Kenya Williams was beautiful, even in what appeared to be a professional headshot. Her eyes held a determination that was almost unnerving. And what's in it for her? Someone asked. Oh, she'll be well compensated, Montgomery assured. She's had to stop working due to her condition. Medical bills are piling up. A generous marriage settlement would solve all her problems. Marcus walked to the bar and poured himself another drink. You're suggesting I marry a woman who's dying, just to prove I can do it? Unless you're afraid, Montgomery challenged. Afraid you might actually feel something, or afraid your reputation can't handle marrying someone like her. The jab hit its mark. Marcus Sterling had built his empire by never backing down from a challenge. His pride wouldn't let him walk away now. Draw up the papers, Marcus said finally. But I want those shares in writing, and I choose how to approach her with the proposal. Montgomery grinned triumphantly. Of course. But remember, 6 months of real marriage, living together, public appearances, the whole deal. No hiding her away in some private estate. As the men around him began discussing the details, Marcus returned to the window. He pulled up Kenya's photo on his phone again. According to the information Montgomery had shared, she was 35, graduated top of her class from Harvard Law, and had spent her career fighting for civil rights until her diagnosis forced her to step back. He told himself it was just business. 6 months of playing husband to a dying woman in exchange for billions in valuable shares. He'd done harder things to build his empire. What Marcus didn't know, as he stood there making plans, was that this bet would change everything he thought he knew about himself. He didn't know that Kenya Williams would turn out to be unlike anyone he'd ever met. And he certainly didn't know that this calculated business arrangement would evolve into something that would leave him completely speechless. But for now, he simply typed out an email to his lawyers, instructing them to begin the paperwork. In his mind, this was just another transaction, another challenge to conquer, another story to add to his legend. How wrong he was. The pristine halls of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center were quiet as Marcus Sterling made his way to the oncology ward. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floor, drawing curious glances from nurses and patients alike. It wasn't every day that a billionaire walked these halls. Kenya Williams sat in her hospital room, reviewing legal documents even during her chemotherapy session. Her head was wrapped in a beautiful African print scarf, and despite her condition, her eyes remained sharp and focused. When Marcus entered, she didn't immediately look up. Ms. Williams, Marcus cleared his throat. I'm Marcus Sterling. I know who you are, Kenya replied, finally meeting his gaze. The question is, why is a tech billionaire visiting a dying lawyer? Marcus had prepared a speech, but something about her direct approach threw him off balance. He sat in the chair beside her bed, maintaining what he thought was a respectful distance. I have a proposition for you, he began, trying to sound businesslike. A marriage proposal, to be specific. Kenya's laugh was unexpected, rich and genuine despite her weakened state. I must be hallucinating from the chemo. Did you just say marriage proposal? I'm completely serious, Marcus continued, pulling out a contract from his briefcase. A 6-month marriage arrangement. In return, you'll receive a settlement of $50 million, full coverage of all medical expenses, and a permanent insurance policy. Kenya set aside her papers and studied him carefully. Mr. Sterling, I may be dying, but I haven't lost my ability to read people. What's the real story here? Her directness caught him off guard again. Most people he dealt with danced around subjects, afraid to offend him. But Kenya Williams spoke with the confidence of someone who had nothing to lose. There's a business deal involved, he admitted, not meeting her eyes. The marriage would help me secure certain assets. And you chose the dying black woman as your bride? Kenya's voice was sharp. How convenient. A wife who won't be around long enough to claim too much of your precious fortune. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. The compensation is substantial. Let me tell you something about my life, Mr. Sterling, Kenya interrupted. Before cancer, I spent every day fighting for people whose society had written off. I worked 18-hour days trying to change a system that's stacked against minorities. And now you walk in here thinking you can buy me for your business game. The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus had faced hostile takeovers and brutal board meetings, but this woman's quiet dignity made him feel smaller than any business rival ever had. Then Kenya did something unexpected. She reached for her laptop and pulled up a webpage. Do you know what this is? Marcus leaned forward to look. It was a proposal for a legal foundation, the Williams Justice Initiative. This was my dream, Kenya explained. A foundation to provide legal support to underprivileged communities. Free representation for civil rights cases, educational programs, advocacy work. I had everything planned, but then cancer happened. The funds I'd saved went to medical bills instead. She turned to face Marcus fully. So here's my counter-proposal, Mr. Sterling. I'll marry you for your 6 months. But the settlement money goes directly to establishing this foundation, and you'll use your connections to help get it off the ground. Marcus stared at her, amazed by her negotiating skills even in her weakened state. You do that? Marry a stranger to fund your foundation. I'm dying, Mr. Sterling, Kenya said matter-of-factly, but that doesn't mean I can't still make a difference. So what do you say? Is your business deal worth helping my cause? Marcus looked at the contract in his hands, then at the foundation proposal on her laptop. He had expected this meeting to be a simple transaction. Instead, he was facing a woman who was turning his own game around on him. We have a deal, he said finally, extending his hand. Kenya shook it firmly. One more thing, she added. Whatever your real reason is for this marriage, I expect honesty in all other matters. I won't be anyone's silent, submissive wife, even for 6 months. As Marcus left the hospital that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that he just entered into something far more complex than he planned. Kenya Williams wasn't just accepting his deal. She was rewriting it on her own terms. What he didn't realize was that this was just the beginning of how she would challenge everything he thought he knew about life, love, and what truly matters in the end. The first month of their marriage brought changes that neither Marcus nor Kenya had fully anticipated. Marcus's sprawling penthouse apartment, once a testament to minimalist luxury, now had to accommodate medical equipment and regular visits from nurses. The spare room closest to the master bedroom was converted into Kenya's personal space, though they kept separate bedrooms as agreed. One morning, Marcus found himself frozen in the doorway of their shared kitchen. Kenya was sitting at the breakfast bar, her laptop open, conducting a video call with young lawyers despite looking exhausted from her recent chemotherapy session. Remember, she was saying to the eager faces on her screen, when you're representing clients from marginalized communities, you're not just handling the case, you're holding their trust, their hopes. Her voice was weak, but carried the weight of experience. Marcus tried to slip away unnoticed, but Kenya caught his movement. "Mr. Sterling," she called out, still formal despite their married status, "would you like to join us? I'm mentoring some law students from my old firm." Caught off guard, Marcus awkwardly stepped into view of the camera. The young lawyer's eyes widened with recognition. Here was the famous tech billionaire, standing in his kitchen in casual clothes, looking decidedly uncomfortable. "I don't want to interrupt," he said stiffly. "Actually," Kenya responded, "your perspective could be valuable. We're discussing corporate responsibility in civil rights cases." Before Marcus could decline, one of the students spoke up. "Mr. Sterling, what's your view on tech companies' role in addressing racial discrimination in AI algorithms?" Marcus felt trapped. This was exactly the kind of conversation he usually avoided. But as he looked at Kenya's challenging gaze, he found himself pulling up a chair. "Honestly," he began, "it's something I haven't given enough attention to in my own company." The admission surprised even him. The discussion that followed was unlike any Marcus had experienced in his corporate boardrooms. These young lawyers, under Kenya's guidance, spoke about real people affected by technological biases, about communities left behind by digital advancement. Later that afternoon, Marcus found Kenya asleep on the couch, her laptop still open beside her. Without thinking, he covered her with a blanket. As he did so, he noticed the document she'd been working on, a detailed proposal for implementing diversity oversight in tech companies. The next few weeks fell into an unexpected rhythm. Marcus would wake early for his business calls, only to find Kenya already up, working on her foundation plans despite her declining health. She never complained about the pain, but he learned to read the signs. The way she pressed her fingers to her temples, how she'd sometimes grip the kitchen counter for support. One evening, as Marcus returned from a board meeting, he heard music coming from Kenya's room. Following the sound, he found her watching old videos of herself dancing at a family gathering. The contrast between the vibrant woman on screen and the one sitting in bed was stark. "My sister's wedding," Kenya explained, noticing him in the doorway. 2 years ago, before the diagnosis. She smiled at the memory. "I used to love dancing." Marcus stepped into the room, surprising both of them. "Tell me about it," he said, sitting in the chair beside her bed. "About your life before." For the first time, Kenya spoke about her childhood dreams, her struggles through law school, the cases that had shaped her career. Marcus found himself sharing too, about the pressure of building his empire, the loneliness at the top. Their conversation was interrupted by Kenya's sudden coughing fit. Without hesitation, Marcus helped her sit up, holding her glass of water. In that moment, something shifted between them. "You know," Kenya said once she'd caught her breath, "for someone who made a bet to marry a dying woman, you're not terrible at playing husband." Marcus froze. "How did you?" "I may be sick, but my network of contacts is still strong," she said with a knowing look. "I knew about the bet before you walked into my hospital room." "Why did you agree then?" Marcus asked, genuinely puzzled. Kenya's answer was simple but profound. "Sometimes, Mr. Sterling, the best way to change a system is from within, even if you don't have much time left to do it." That night, as Marcus lay awake in his room, he realized that what had started as a calculated business move was becoming something he couldn't control. Kenya Williams wasn't just a transaction anymore. She was becoming someone who made him question everything he thought he knew about success, about life, and about himself. The night everything changed started like any other. Marcus was in his home office, reviewing quarterly reports, when he heard a crash from Kenya's room. Running to investigate, he found her collapsed on the bathroom floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Kenya." He rushed to her side, his heart pounding. Her skin was burning with fever, and her breathing was shallow. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. "Put me down," she protested weakly. "I can manage." "Stop being stubborn for once," Marcus snapped, already heading for the elevator. His driver was called, and within minutes, they were racing through Manhattan's streets toward the hospital. In the emergency room, Marcus found himself pacing anxiously while doctors worked to stabilize Kenya's condition. The waiting room was crowded with people from all walks of life, and for the first time, he noticed how different their experiences were. While he could demand the best care money could buy, others waited hours for basic attention. "Mr. Sterling." A nurse approached him. "Your wife is asking for you." Kenya lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller than ever among the tubes and monitors. But her eyes were alert, watching him as he entered. "You didn't have to stay," she said softly. "Don't be ridiculous," he replied, taking the seat beside her bed. "Of course I stayed." The great Marcus Sterling, spending his night in a hospital instead of closing million-dollar deals. She managed a weak smile. "What would your board members say?" "They can say whatever they want." His response surprised them both. Throughout the night, as Kenya drifted in and out of sleep, Marcus remained. He watched the nurses check her vitals, listened to the steady beep of monitors, and found himself thinking about the past 2 months of their unusual marriage. During one of her wakeful periods, Kenya began talking about a case she'd handled years ago. It was a young boy, she recalled. His school was denying him advanced classes despite his test scores, claiming he wasn't a good fit. We all knew what that meant. Marcus leaned forward, intrigued. "What did you do?" "Filed a discrimination suit. Spent months gathering evidence, interviewing teachers, reviewing past cases." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "When we won, it wasn't just for him. It set a precedent for hundreds of other students." "Is that why you became a lawyer?" Marcus asked. Kenya nodded. "My father was wrongfully arrested when I was 12. The public defender was overwhelmed, barely looked at his case. But then a civil rights attorney took interest. She fought for him, proved his innocence." She paused, catching her breath. "That's when I knew what I wanted to do with my life." As dawn broke over the city, doctors came with test results. Kenya's immune system was severely compromised from the chemotherapy, making her vulnerable to infections. They wanted to keep her for observation. "I need my laptop," was Kenya's first response. "I have a mentoring session scheduled." "You need rest," Marcus countered. Then, surprising himself again, he added, "I'll handle the mentoring session." Kenya stared at him. "You? I may not be a lawyer, but I know something about corporate law and technology rights. Besides," he smiled slightly, "I've been listening to your sessions for weeks now." That afternoon, Marcus found himself facing Kenya's group of young lawyers through a video call. He spoke about technology's impact on civil rights, shared insights about corporate responsibility, and even discussed ways to challenge discriminatory practices in the tech industry. When he returned to the hospital that evening, Kenya was sitting up, reading through messages on her phone. "Your students are quite impressed," she said. "Apparently, you gave them valuable insights about approaching tech companies for pro bono partnerships." Marcus sat down heavily in his chair. "I never realized how much impact legal advocacy could have until I met you," he admitted. "I've spent years focusing on profit margins and market expansion, while you've been actually changing lives." Kenya reached out and touched his hand, the first time she'd initiated such contact. "It's never too late to make a difference, Marcus." The use of his first name didn't escape his notice. Neither did the warmth that spread through his chest at her touch. That night marked a turning point. As Marcus watched Kenya sleep, monitors beeping steadily beside her, he realized something that terrified him. He was falling in love with his temporary wife. And unlike his business deals and calculated risks, this was something he hadn't planned for at all. After Kenya's hospitalization, Marcus found himself doing something he'd never done before, rearranging his entire schedule around someone else's needs. He started attending her chemotherapy sessions, laptop in hand, working quietly beside her bed while she received treatment. During one such session, Richard Montgomery, the man who had initiated the bet, spotted them through the treatment room's window. His smirk was visible even from a distance as he walked in. Well, Montgomery drawled. "Marcus Sterling playing devoted husband. This is quite a sight." Kenya, who had been dozing, opened her eyes. Marcus tensed, but she squeezed his hand gently. "Mr. Montgomery," she said coolly, "what brings you to the oncology ward?" "Just checking on our mutual investment," Montgomery replied, his words deliberately cruel, "making sure Marcus is fulfilling his part of the arrangement." Before Marcus could respond, Kenya sat up straighter. "You mean the arrangement where you bet on my life? How much was it again, Richard? 2 billion? Montgomery's smile faltered. "You know? I've known from the start," Kenya said calmly. "And I also know about your company's discrimination lawsuit that was quietly settled last year. Interesting reading, those court documents." The color drained from Montgomery's face. Marcus watched in amazement as his wife, weak from treatment but fierce in spirit, stared down one of New York's most powerful men. "You should leave," Marcus said quietly to Montgomery. "My wife needs her rest." After Montgomery hurried out, Kenya relaxed back against her pillows. "Your friend's not very subtle." "He's not my friend," Marcus replied firmly, "and I'm sorry you had to deal with that." "I've dealt with worse," she said, then changed the subject. "Tell me about your day instead." Marcus found himself sharing details about his latest project, a new technology platform. To his surprise, Kenya asked insightful questions about user accessibility and community impact. "Have you considered partnering with community organizations for beta testing?" she suggested. "It could help identify barriers we might not see." Her use of "we" didn't escape his notice. Increasingly, he found himself incorporating her suggestions into his business decisions, seeing his work through new eyes. Later that week, during a board meeting, Marcus proposed a new initiative, a technology access program for underserved communities, with legal support for digital rights. His board members were stunned. "This doesn't sound like you, Marcus," one director commented. "Maybe it's time I started sounding more like this," he replied. At home, Kenya's condition seemed to worsen despite the treatments. Some days, she could barely leave her bed. Yet she continued her mentoring sessions, now with Marcus's active participation. They made an unexpected team, her legal expertise combining with his business acumen to guide the next generation of civil rights attorneys. One evening, as they sat in the living room reviewing applications for her foundation, Kenya suddenly said, "You've changed." Marcus looked up from the papers. "How so?" "3 months ago, you wouldn't have been caught dead helping review scholarships for minority law students," she said. "Now look at you, making notes about potential candidates and their community impact." "I had a good teacher," he replied softly. "Marcus," she hesitated, "when this is over." "Don't," he interrupted. "Please." But Kenya persisted. "When this is over, promise me you'll continue the foundation's work. These students need advocates like you, someone who understands both corporate power and social responsibility." Marcus set aside the applications and moved closer to her. "You'll be here to run it yourself." Kenya gave him a sad smile. "We both know that's not likely. The doctors don't know everything," he insisted, taking her hand. "And I'm not ready to let you go." The words hummed between them, heavy with meaning. It was the closest either had come to acknowledging how their feelings had changed. That night, after helping Kenya to her room, Marcus made several calls. He reached out to top oncologists worldwide, commissioned new research studies, and began exploring experimental treatments. Money was no object, not anymore. In his office, he looked at a photo taken at a recent foundation event. Kenya was smiling, surrounded by her student mentees, with him standing proudly beside her. The image barely resembled the calculating businessman who had agreed to a cruel bet months ago. What had started as a business transaction had become something else entirely. Now, Marcus Sterling, the man who had everything, faced the terrifying prospect of losing the one thing money couldn't buy, the woman who had changed his heart. The autumn wind whipped around them as Marcus wheeled Kenya onto the hospital's rooftop garden. She had insisted on fresh air, tired of the sterile hospital rooms where she'd spent the past week. Her condition had deteriorated rapidly, but her spirit remained unbroken. "The Foundation's first case goes to court next week," Kenya said, clutching a tablet despite the doctor's orders to rest. "Our team is representing a group of students fighting discriminatory AI testing systems." Marcus adjusted her blanket against the chill. "I've arranged for the best tech experts to testify, and the legal team is well prepared." "Our legal team," she corrected him with a smile. "I never thought I'd see the day when Marcus Sterling would be personally involved in a civil rights case." He knelt beside her wheelchair. "I never thought I'd see the day when I care about something more than money." Their quiet moment was interrupted by Kenya's doctor, Dr. Thompson, who had been searching for them. His face carried news, and from his expression, it wasn't good. "The latest treatment isn't working as we hoped," he explained gently. "The cancer is spreading more aggressively than we anticipated." Marcus felt Kenya's hand tighten in his. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady. "Weeks, possibly days," Dr. Thompson replied. "I'm so sorry." After the doctor left, they sat in silence, watching the sun set over Manhattan's skyline. Finally, Kenya spoke. We need to talk about what happens next. No, Marcus stood abruptly. I'm not giving up. There are other treatments, experimental protocols. Marcus, she interrupted softly. Listen to me. The foundation needs to continue. Those students, their cases, their futures, it all needs to keep going. It will? He promised. But with you running it. Kenya reached up to touch his face. You know that's not possible now, but you can do it. You've learned so much these past months. You understand now what we're fighting for. That evening, back in their penthouse, Marcus found Kenya in her study, surrounded by papers and legal documents. Despite her weakening condition, she was determined to finish organizing everything for the foundation. Remember that first case I told you about? She asked as he brought her tea. The young boy denied access to advanced classes. Marcus nodded, sitting beside her. He graduated last week, top of his class, going to MIT. Her eyes shone with pride. One case, one child, but it created ripples. That's what this work is about, creating ripples that become waves of change. Suddenly, she gasped in pain. Marcus quickly called for their in-home nurse, but Kenya waved them both away. I'm fine. Just tired. But I need to finish this. You need to rest, Marcus insisted. What I need, she said firmly, is to know that everything we built together won't end with me. Marcus looked at the woman before him, still fighting, still teaching, still changing the world even as her own time grew short. This wasn't the marriage he bet on. This was something far more precious and important. That night, after Kenya had finally agreed to rest, Marcus made a decision. He called his company's board of directors for an emergency meeting. Effective immediately, he announced the next morning, Sterling Tech is establishing a permanent civil rights division. We're committing $5 billion to support the Williams Justice Initiative over the next decade. The board members were stunned. This was far more than the original bet had been worth. But Marcus wasn't finished. Furthermore, we're implementing mandatory bias testing in all our AI systems, establishing scholarship programs for minority students in tech and law, and creating a legal fund for civil rights cases. When he told Kenya about his announcement, she tried to sit up in her hospital bed. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he replied, because you taught me that real change isn't about winning bets or making deals. It's about using what you have to lift others up. Kenya smiled weakly. Who would have thought? The billionaire who married a dying woman for a bet, ending up revolutionizing his entire company for civil rights. Who would have thought? Marcus agreed, holding her hand, that in trying to win a bet, I'd find something worth so much more. As night fell over the city, Marcus watched Kenya sleep, her breathing growing more labored each day. The bet that had brought them together was long forgotten, replaced by something far more meaningful, a legacy of justice and change that would continue long after she was gone. But for now, all he could do was hold her hand and pray for more time, even as it slipped away like sand through their fingers. The hospital corridor was silent except for Marcus's footsteps as he paced outside the testing lab. Kenya had been inside for hours, undergoing a new series of scans. The last few days had been a blur of tests, sparked by something Dr. Thompson had noticed in her latest blood work. Mr. Sterling. Dr. Thompson emerged, holding a stack of papers. His face was unreadable. Please, come with me. In his office, the doctor spread out several scan results. I've never seen anything like this in my career, he began. The cancer cells, they're retreating. Marcus stared at him. What? The experimental treatment we tried 2 months ago, it appears to have triggered an unexpected response in her immune system. The cancer isn't gone, but it's definitely receding. Significantly. Marcus collapsed into a chair. Are you saying she's not dying? I'm saying, Dr. Thompson smiled, that Kenya has a fighting chance, a real one. When they shared the news with Kenya, she remained characteristically calm. Are you sure? She asked, reviewing the test results herself. Years of legal training had taught her to question everything, even miracles. We'll need to continue treatment, Dr. Thompson explained. But yes, we're sure. Your body is responding remarkably well. That evening, back in their penthouse, Kenya found Marcus on the balcony, staring at the city lights. You haven't said much since we got the news, she observed. I don't know what to say, he admitted. I've been preparing to lose you, learning to treasure every moment because I thought they were numbered. And now, and now you're stuck with me. Kenya finished. Not exactly what you signed up for when you made that bet. The word bet hit Marcus like a physical blow. In the joy and relief of the good news, he'd almost forgotten how their marriage had started. The shame of it overwhelmed him. Kenya, he turned to face her, I need to tell you something. About the bet. Marcus, she interrupted. I already told you I knew about the bet from the beginning. No, you need to understand, he insisted. That man who made that bet, I don't even recognize him anymore. These past months with you, you've changed everything. How I see the world, how I run my company, how I understand justice and privilege and responsibility. Kenya stepped closer to him. I know. Why do you think I agreed to the marriage? What do you mean? I did my research before I said yes, she explained. I saw a man with enormous power and resources who had never used them for real change. I thought if I could open your eyes, even a little, during whatever time I had left, she smiled. I just didn't expect to stick around to see the results. Marcus shook his head in amazement. So while I thought I was winning a bet, you were actually executing a long-term strategy for social change? Once a lawyer, always a lawyer, she laughed. Then her face grew serious. But something else happened, didn't it? Something neither of us planned for. Marcus took her hands in his. I fell in love with you, really in love. Not because of any bet or strategy or business deal. Just because you're you. And I fell in love with you, Kenya admitted. Not the billionaire, not the tech mogul, but the man who sat through chemotherapy sessions with me, who learned about civil rights law just to understand my work better, who saw beyond his own privilege to fight for others. Their moment was interrupted by Kenya's phone buzzing. It was her medical team, scheduling follow-up appointments and additional treatments. The road ahead would still be challenging, but now it stretched further than they dared hope. So, Kenya said after finishing the call, what happens now? Our 6-month agreement is almost up. Marcus looked at her, this woman who had walked into his life because of a cruel bet and stayed to change everything. Now, he said, if you're willing, I'd like to tear up that contract and ask you to marry me again. Not for 6 months. Not for a bet. But for real. On one condition, Kenya replied, her eyes twinkling. We use the wedding to raise funds for the foundation's next phase. Marcus laughed. Always the strategist. Always fighting for justice, she corrected. Just now with a partner who understands the fight. As they stood together on the balcony, their city spread out before them, both realized that sometimes the greatest miracles aren't just about healing bodies. They're about healing hearts and changing minds, about turning calculated business deals into genuine love stories that could change the world. 1 year after Kenya's miraculous recovery, the grand ballroom of New York's Plaza Hotel buzzed with excitement. The occasion was a dual celebration, the first anniversary of the guest list was unlike any other high society event in the city's history. Corporate executives mingled with civil rights activists. Law students chatted with tech entrepreneurs. In one corner, Montgomery, now a changed man himself, discussed diversity initiatives with young lawyers Kenya had mentored. Kenya stood at the podium, radiant in a white gown that celebrated her African heritage. Her hair had grown back, styled in elegant braids adorned with golden threads. The cancer was in remission, though regular checkups remained part of their life. A year ago, she began, I thought I was making a deal with the devil. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Instead, I found a partner in every sense of the word. Together, we've achieved more than I ever dreamed possible. She gestured to the screens behind her, displaying the initiative's achievements. 50 successful civil rights cases, hundreds of scholarships awarded, and groundbreaking changes in corporate diversity policies. Sterling Tech had become a model for ethical AI development and inclusive business practices. Marcus watched his wife with pride, remembering how far they'd come. The man who had once made a callous bet would never have imagined standing here, genuinely moved by stories of lives changed and barriers broken. But tonight isn't just about numbers and achievements, Kenya continued. It's about transformation, about how love can change not just two people, but create ripples that touch countless lives. She shared the story of their first scholarship recipient, a young woman from the Bronx who was now clerking for a Supreme Court justice. then spoke about the tech program that had brought coding education to inner-city schools. Marcus joined her at the podium, taking her hand. When I first walked into that hospital room with a business proposal, I thought I knew everything about success, he admitted to the crowd. Kenya taught me that true success isn't measured in billions, but in lives improved and barriers broken. The couple announced their biggest initiative yet, a $10 billion commitment to expand the foundation's work globally. The ballroom erupted in applause. Later that evening, they shared their first dance as a truly married couple. "Remember our first corporate event together?" Kenya asked, smiling up at him. "How could I forget? I was terrified you'd expose the bet to everyone," Marcus chuckled. "Instead, I made you sit through a 3-hour discussion about technological discrimination. Best education I ever received," he said softly. As they danced, Marcus noticed something different in Kenya's expression. "Everything okay?" She took a deep breath. "I got my latest test results yesterday. I was waiting for the right moment to tell you." Marcus's heart stopped for a moment, fear gripping him. "The doctor says I'm officially cancer-free," she announced, eyes shining. "And we're going to have a baby." Marcus stopped dancing, staring at her in wonder. They had been told the cancer treatments might have made this impossible. "Are you sure?" he whispered. 3 months along, she confirmed. "Our little miracle." As joy spread across Marcus's face, Kenya added with a grin, "I'm thinking we should name the foundation's next youth program after them." "Already planning their future in social justice?" Marcus laughed, pulling her close. "Of course. They'll be half Sterling, half Williams. Imagine the potential for change." The celebration continued around them, but they remained lost in their own world, dancing slowly, dreaming of their future. The bet that had brought them together was now nothing more than a story they would tell their child someday. A story about how love can grow in the most unexpected places, and how sometimes the greatest wins come from losing your heart completely. As the evening drew to a close, Kenya and Marcus stood on the hotel's balcony, overlooking the city they were helping to change. "Think Montgomery ever regrets making that bet?" Kenya asked playfully. "Probably," Marcus smiled. "He lost $2 billion and gained a conscience. But I'd say I got the better deal." "Oh, how so?" "I bet on winning money," he said, pulling her close. "Instead, I want a whole new life, a true purpose, and a love I never knew I needed." Kenya leaned into him, their hands intertwined over their growing miracle. Below them, the city stretched out, not just a landscape of buildings and streets, but a world of possibilities they would shape together, one case, one program, one life at a time. The bet was long forgotten, replaced by something far more valuable, a love story that had changed not just 2 hearts, but countless lives, and their greatest chapters were still to come.